Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into tons of interesting topics, and another where we dive into tons of interesting books and stories. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about Rosa Parks. This is a continuation of my series of people who made a difference fighting for a cause in the civil rights era and going all the way back to the turn of the century into the late 1800s when women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton made a difference. You had Eleanor Roosevelt as you went through World War II, and Lyndon B. Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., could it be argued that he wouldn't have made a difference in the life of our society if it wasn't for this woman, Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her bus seat on December 1st, 1955. That's what we're going to talk about. That was the seminal moment that started everything. The road to civil rights reform down in the South began when one day this woman was just too tired and she refused to give up her seat. She was ready. Listen, if you look back on this, was this just any ordinary person who just happened to not want to get out of her seat? Well, that's true, but what's not told too often is that, yes, she was ready for this moment. She was a trained activist. She was a respected community leader, and she had spent years fighting segregation before December 1st, 1955. She was born Rosa Louise McCauley on February 4th, 1913, in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her father, James McCauley, was a carpenter. Her mother, Leona, was a teacher. She had one younger brother, Sylvester. When she was young, her parents separated and she moved with her mother to her grandparents' farm near Pine Level, Alabama. Growing up in Alabama during the era of Jim Crow segregation meant that she saw equality every day. She later remembered seeing black children walk miles to school while white children rode buses. She remembers the nights that her grandfather sat on her porch just because of threats from nearby black families and nearby black community members. Those experiences shaped her long before the bus incident. And what we have to do now, especially for my younger members of the audience, we need to understand and explain what Jim Crow means. When you say the Jim Crow South, you're talking about the time period where there was segregation. Again, segregation means purposely separating groups of people and discriminating against them. Discrimination means treating people unfairly, differently, just because of how they look. It could be other reasons when you're talking about discrimination. It could be their religion, it could be their disability, their age. But in this case, when we're talking about segregation in the South, they called it Jim Crow laws because this term, it comes from, believe it or not, a theater presentation. It was in the 1830s. There was a white performer by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice, and he popularized this character that performed in blackface, literally painting your face black if you were white. And he sang this song called Jump Jim Crow. The whole routine mocked black people, and it portrayed them as being goofy and really inferior. So as the states in the South began segregating and setting up these laws where people, black and white, had to be separated, Jim Crow became this term that was derogatory, and it described, obviously, segregated sections throughout the South. Over time, the character's name became shorthand for the entire legal system of racial segregation. So when you say Jim Crow, that's what we're referring to, this entire time period, late 1800s right through to the 1960s, when the national laws were changed with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is the time period that Rosa Parks lived in. And when we think of segregation, you cannot underestimate how society was so different down in the South. And it wasn't just buses. Listen to this. Black Americans were commonly separated from whites on trains, in railroad waiting rooms, schools, libraries, restaurants, movie theaters, parks, swimming pools, drinking fountains, public restrooms, hospitals, hotels, courtroom seats, voting registration offices, cemeteries, beaches, college, state fairs, city facilities. The list goes on and on. So this had to end. All of this had to end. And there was one moment, one day, and again, Rosa Parks was the woman who started everything on the way to change. When she was 19, she married Raymond Parks. That was important. Raymond was already active in civil rights causes, and it helped bring to light to her so many of the injustices. They were married for 45 years until her husband passed away in 1977. In the 1940s, Rosa joined the NAACP, which was an organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's still around today and by far the oldest and largest grassroots civil rights organization. She became secretary of the Montgomery Alabama chapter. She investigated racial violence, she helped document discrimination, and she worked on voter registration efforts. She herself had to try multiple times before Alabama finally allowed her to register to vote. Imagine that. She was not someone who suddenly became involved in civil rights on that day when she refused to give up her seat. She had been involved with this cause for over a decade. And the bus driver that told her to give up her seat, they already knew each other. His name was James F. Blake. 12 years before, in 1943, Rosa had boarded his bus. The drivers at this time had required, listen to this, black bus riders to do the following. They had to pay in front of the bus, then they had to get off the bus, and then they had to re-enter the bus through the back door. Well, on that day, before Rosa could re-enter the bus in the back, he drove away and left her standing in the rain. She never forgot it. So when she stepped onto this bus in December 1955, they weren't strangers. And this is important to understand as well. Rosa wasn't the first. She was not the first person to refuse to get out of her bus seat. There were others. One of the most famous was Claudette Colvin on March 2nd, 1955, 9 months before Rosa refused to give up her seat. She did the same thing. She was arrested and she was only 15 years old. There were others that had done the same thing. Civil rights leaders admired Colvin's courage, but they believed that Rosa Parks could make a stronger legal test because she was 42 years old, she was employed, she was respected, she was married and deeply involved in the community. Interesting. So here we are, like I said, it's December 1st, 1955. It was a Thursday. It was 5:30 p.m. She was lost in thought. She had a hard day, long day at work as a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store. She didn't notice when she got on the bus, it was the same bus driver, James F. Blake. She later said if she saw him, if she knew he was the bus driver, she would have never boarded the bus. So she's headed down Cleveland Avenue. The front 10 seats were reserved for white passengers, so she sat in the first row of the black section, directly behind the white section. 3 other black passengers occupied the same row. As the bus filled up, one white man was left standing. Blake, the bus driver, moved the dividing line and ordered all 4 black passengers to surrender the row. 3 complied. Parks didn't. Blake, are you going to stand up? No. If you don't stand up, I'm calling the police. You may do that. It was that simple. People say, like I referenced earlier, the prevailing narrative is that she was simply tired. She later corrected that story herself. She said she was not physically tired. She was just tired of giving in. This was a deliberate act, not spontaneous, not accidental. It was deliberate. So yes, she was tired, but it wasn't, like I said, about being tired from a long day at work and not wanting to move. She was tired of the treatment, the discrimination, the segregation, everything. So Blake called the police. They boarded the bus. One officer asked why she wouldn't stand. Parks came back and said, "Why do you push us around?" Why? Because the law is the law. She was arrested. She was taken to police headquarters, booked, fingerprinted, briefly jailed. Her mother, she called her mother. And all her mother wanted to know, her first question is, did they hurt you? Thankfully, they didn't. The boycott now began. Within hours, civil rights leaders moved into action. They arranged bail for her. Meanwhile, there was this educator by the name of Joanne Robinson. She worked through the night with hundreds of other people. They volunteered and they got out 50,000, listen to this, 50,000 leaflets calling for a one-day bus boycott. The boycott was scheduled for that Monday, the 5th, only 4 days after she was arrested. It was the day of her trial. The result, this one-day bus boycott, stunned everyone. Approximately 90% of black riders stayed off the buses. Now, the first major civil rights leader that was involved the moment she got arrested, it wasn't Martin Luther King Jr. It was a fellow by the name of E.D. Nixon. He was a longtime organizer, and he definitely was one of the most influential black activists in Montgomery, Alabama. Someone notified Nixon that Parks had been arrested. Nixon immediately understood something was important about this. He called Rosa's home. He asked her if she would be willing to fight the case in court. Rosa agreed, and Nixon later realized that yes, she was the ideal person to get the word out. So along with Nixon and Robinson had actually warned city officials years earlier that a bus boycott could happen if conditions didn't improve. So Martin Luther King Jr. only became involved because E.D. Nixon picked up the phone and was looking for supporters of this one-day boycott. He called ministers throughout the city. King was one of them. He was only 26 years old. He had just arrived in Montgomery the year before. He was the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and Robinson knew him as well. So Rosa was found guilty of not giving up her seat. She was fined a total of $14, which she ultimately appealed, but she ended up paying 2 years later. But here's the important thing that happened. The next night, on December 2nd, all the organizers had gotten together and decided that this would be a permanent boycott. It lasted almost a year. And here's the amazing story. Where did this meeting take place? At the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. People assumed years later that King was chosen because he was already famous. It was just the opposite. He was chosen because he was relatively unknown. And he was chosen. Why? He was educated, as I discussed on my previous episode of Martin Luther King Jr. Definitely worth a listen. He was an excellent speaker. He was respected early on by the other ministers across the city. He was certainly young. He was energetic. And here's the most important part. He had not yet become entangled in Montgomery local rivalries. I mean, older leaders, they had long-standing disagreements with each other. King was a fresh face. Nixon supported him. Robinson supported him. But here's the thing. Rosa Parks sparked the fire. E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson organized the first response, and the overwhelming success of this one-day boycott created the opening through which MLK Jr. emerged as the movement's spokesman and leader. No doubts. The bus boycott, it lasted for 381 days. Black residents walked, carpooled, shared rides, took taxis, everything except taking the city buses. They walked miles to work every day because more than 70% of the bus riders were black. The boycott hit the bus companies hard financially. Eventually, a lawsuit was filed, and listen to this. In 1956, on November 13th, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it upheld a ruling that declared that, yes, bus segregation is unconstitutional. It was against the law. The bus boycott ended in victory. What happened to Rosa? Victory. This victory came with a price. The reality, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. She lost her job. Her husband lost his job. They were receiving threats constantly. They struggled financially. In 1957, just a couple years later, they moved north to Detroit. Many people think that this was the end of her standing up for what is right. It wasn't. She ended up spending the next 50 years fighting for civil rights, voting rights, housing equality, and criminal justice reform. She worked for Congressman John Conyers and stayed active well into her old age. She passed away on October 24th, 2005, not that long ago. She was 92 years old, and listen to this. She became the first woman to lie in honor in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Millions mourned her. Here is the fact about her life. People remember her for this one bus ride, but she spent decades preparing for that moment. She was not famous because she just happened to be sitting in the right seat. She became famous because when history demanded someone stand up, in her case, she didn't stand up. She continued to sit down. And it's because she stayed in that seat that we as a society are so much better off. Friends, thanks for taking this journey with me, learning all about Rosa Parks. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group. We have a YouTube channel. Hit that plus button in the top right-hand corner to get subscribed to the podcast. Reach out to friends, family, anybody you can refer the podcast to. Most appreciated. Love the reviews. Love the ratings on Apple Podcasts. So until next time, have fun and keep learning.